Under the Royal Palms by Alma Flor Ade, A Childhood in Cuba, read by Vienna. Introduction. During my childhood, I lived in Camagüey, the city where I was born, in the eastern part of Cuba, one of the many islands in the Caribbean Sea. The four larger islands in the Caribbean are called Greater Antilles. They include Hispaniola, the island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba. Of all these islands, Cuba, long and narrow, is the largest of all. It lies very close to the southern tip of Florida. Because Cuba is located at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, it is sometimes called the Key to the Gulf. On account of its beauty, its fertile land, and its incomparable weather, never too humid nor too hot, it is also called the Pearl of the Antilles. When I was growing up, Camagüey was a quiet place. In Cuba, we called it a city, but in a larger country, it would have been called a town. With my mother and father. Many of its streets were narrow and winding, and most were paved with stones. After a rain, the gray stones were slippery and dangerous for the horses that pulled the carts of the milkmen, the bakers, and the coal vendors. It always upset me deeply to see a horse slip and fall on the wet stones. Not many people had private cars. Most used public transportation. Crowded buses or slow and noisy street cars called tranvías. We also probably walked much more than most people in the United States today to go to school or to work, to go shopping, or to visit relatives or friends in the afternoon, something we often did without giving them notice, and a custom we all welcomed. The majority of the houses had tile roofs with gutters to gather the rainwater. The colonial houses in the center of town were spacious, usually built around a central courtyard, with large doors and windows that went from ceiling to floor and were protected by carved wooden railings. It was a city of contrasts. Contrasts in the way people behaved, in their beliefs, and in their practices. Although most people would have called Cuba a Catholic country, in reality there were people from many religious traditions. The African people who had been held in slavery used many Catholic symbols and images to continue practicing their own beliefs under the cover of Catholicism. A few people had become Protestants, following the preaching of various American missionaries, Episcopalian, Baptist, Methodist, Adventist. There have always been Jewish people in Spanish-speaking countries, and many more arrived in Cuba fleeing Europe during World War II. Chinese people had been lured to Cuba with the promise of free land. After long years of indentured work on the fields, their perseverance and hard work had allowed most of them to settle in the cities where they owned stores, restaurants, laundry services, or vegetable gardens. Although some of them adopted Christian beliefs, many retained their ancestral religious practices. And then there were the free thinkers, maybe the fewest in number, who believed that spirituality need not be expressed under any specific set of rules. There was a small, economically powerful circle of landowners, cattle ranchers, or professionals who observed European customs and considered themselves more refined. They listened to classical music, went to fine art exhibitions, and longed for theater and ballet. They spoke with controlled voices that displayed their education. And then there was a much greater number of working people, mostly strong, loud, and boisterous, filled with energy and life, whose education was very different from that provided by the schools. Theirs was the education of home traditions and long-held beliefs. The most striking contrasts for me were not the differences in education and beliefs. The largest, most significant contrast was that some had so much and others had very little. While for some life was easy, almost a paradise on this beautiful island, for others the struggle to stay alive was extremely demanding. Many, especially young children, did not survive. Even when I was only a child, these contrasts confused and concerned me. Because Cuba was a very young republic, it had won its independence from Spain in 1889 and from the U.S. in 1902. Less than 40 years before I was born, I heard many stories of the struggle for independence, of the dreams that had inspired the struggle, and of the heroes who had led the way. And I looked around me to see if those ideals were indeed alive, only to be saddened when I realized that in most ways they were not. In the countryside, the majestic royal palms, symbols of Cuban independence, towered above the surrounding trees. But beneath those palms I saw too much poverty and too much pain, and I knew that the realization of the dreams of justice and equality were still far away. My own family was not among the more affluent, but the hard work of many family members who shared the same house kept us from suffering the needs of those who had so little. Yet this was a constant cause of concern and struggle within me. Although very early on I began to realize that real wealth did not lie in material things, my heart was still saddened by those who suffered so much just to survive. I was born in an old house, La Quinta Simoni, a house built during colonial times for an Italian family. One of their daughters, Amalia Simoni, had been born in the house. She married a young lawyer, Ignacio Agramonte, who later wrote the first constitution of the insurgents and fought against the Spanish army to free Cuba from Spanish domination. It moved me to know that the house I loved, that was my own world, had been where Ignacio and Amalia had met, spent time together, and briefly lived after their marriage. Later, Ignacio was killed in battle, and his ashes were scattered because the Spanish government did not want his tomb to become a shrine. For me, the garden where he had strolled with Amalia, the porch where they had exchanged sweet words of love and shared their dreams for an independent Cuba, were indeed a shrine to their ordeals. Alma Flor Ada, 3 years old. My beloved grandmother explained those ideals of freedom and equality to me every evening during the few years we shared. Later, after her death, the house became for us a shrine to her memory as well. In both this book and its companion volume, Where the Flame Trees Bloom, I have shared some of the feelings and memories of my childhood as well as some of the stories that were told to me. Sharing them is my own way of keeping these memories alive and to continue to understand life. I have called this book Under the Royal Palms because the royal palm, standing majestic and alone, rising above the trees that surround it, is the symbol of an independent Cuba. I hope that you will see my stories as an invitation for you to discover the many stories in your own life and the meaning that they hold for you. A royal palm tree. The bats. Daily life in La Quinta Simone started very early in the morning. The placid night fragrances of jasmine and gardenias, which entered my bedroom from the garden, were quickly overtaken by the acrid but friendly smell of coffee brewing. Before I was fully awake, my grandmother would often scoop me in her arms to take me to where they were milking the cows she still kept. Her neck smelled of fresh talcum, and her dress, invariably white, of lavender and sage. When we returned to the house, everyone would be bustling about, getting ready to leave. My father to teach at the high school, my Uncle Manolo to the radio station, my Uncle Medardo to his office, my Aunt Lolita to her classes, and my grandmother to the school she ran. Before long, the big house was all my mother's and mine. La Quinta Simone. While she worked on her bookkeeping ledgers, I would spend hours playing outside under the trees, just by myself. Every afternoon around 4 o'clock, I had to take a bath and get dressed for the evening. I would set aside the boots I hated with their hard insoles to support my flat feet and put on my white shoes with a little strap on top and a buckle on the side. As my mother tied the bow at the back of my dress, I felt like a butterfly, daily forced to return to her chrysalis and daily freed again. The next thing to be done each afternoon was to gather maravillas. These simple wild flowers, red, orange, white, purple, or spotted, opened late in the day. It was as if, like me, they led 2 lives, one curled up and wrinkled in the heat of the day, one open and splendid in the late afternoon as the sun began to go down. They grew plentifully on an empty lot about half a block from the old Quinta Simone. I would walk proudly down the sidewalk, glancing at my shoes, ready to gather as many flowers as I could. On my return, my grandmother would be waiting for me on the front porch, sitting in a rocking chair ready to praise the beauty of my simple offering. Then we would both go on tiptoes as if approaching an altar to place the flowers on top of the piano, a ritual that pleased us both. We made garlands to wrap around the bust of José Martí, the Cuban poet and hero during the struggle for independence, and a doll wearing typical Mayan dress that someone had brought my grandmother from Guatemala. My grandmother would smile and say, "For Martí and his niña de Guatemala." I would smile too, because the poem that Martí had written for a young girl in Guatemala, although very sad, was one of my favorites. And I loved that my grandmother had decided to unite, on top of her piano, the poet and the girl who had died loving him. Once the ritual was finished, we would walk hand in hand out to the large front porch with its high masonry arches. She would sit in the rocking chair. I would sit on the steps a few feet away, listening to her sing verses set to music she herself had composed. Under the shadow of a wing, I will let the story blossom of a young Guatemalan girl who died of a broken heart. The setting sun would turn the sky bright orange, and my grandmother would begin a new song. I tend with care a white rose both in January and in June for the true friend who offers a sincere hand, and for the cruel one who tears out my beating heart. I tend neither thistles nor thorns. I tend with care a white rose. And the night would fall around us, almost without notice as it does in the tropics. Then the first of the bats would appear. They lived above the porch, between the ceiling and the roof. We never saw or heard them during the day, but at nightfall their squeaks began, like an orchestra tuning its instruments before a concert, and it was as if the ceiling came alive. Occasionally, a little one would fall to the floor through a crack in the ceiling, either pushed by a thoughtless adult or as a result of its own carelessness. Even though it was not ready to fly yet, by instinct the little bat would open its membranous wings, glide down, and land alive, although perhaps somewhat stunned. Sometimes an adult bat would come immediately to the rescue. Then the little one would cling to the adult's chest and enjoy a safe return home. But on occasions when no adult came, we had to decide whether to fetch the tall ladder and try to place the baby back in the nest, or keep it in a shoebox and feed it with my doll's bottle. Fortunately, this only happened once in a while. My grandmother Lola. Dolores Salvador Mendez. Most nights, my grandmother and I would pretend to count the bats as they left their nest to feed on the fruit from our backyard, sweet mangoes, guavas, soft and delicious nísperos.